Well, this brings us to the second reason for Christianity's decline in the West. French intellectuals between 1689 and 1789 rejected what Europe had witnessed over the preceding 700 years: papal corruption, the papal schism, the Inquisition, warfare between Rome and Reformation groups, and then bitter division within Reformation groups. And now the French economy was declining under a wealthy divine right monarchy and untaxed church, both seemingly based on the Bible and Christianity. While reformers were trying to distinguish corrupted Christendom from biblical Christianity, many had enough of the church, but preferred deism, retaining God as creator, but after creation only natural processes are at work, with no interventions such as miracles or answered prayer. But the loudest and most persistent voices wanted to be done with the supernatural altogether, preferring a return to ancient Greek materialism and naturalism, a worldview in which only physical matter and natural processes are real. They were confident that if the church and monarchy were gone, France would inherently evolve into an enlightened secular utopia of reason and science. So, for a century, they wrote anonymous articles attacking both the church and monarchy, promoting atheism and anarchy. And after a harsh winter and food shortages in 1789, Paris exploded. The Bastille, a prison for political dissidents, was stormed. Clergy were harassed and killed, and churches were closed and turned into temples of reason. The king and queen were arrested and beheaded. Nobles were rounded up and brought to Paris for public executions. And revolutionary leaders tried and argued over various forms of government until they began sending each other to the guillotines. At that point, in 1799, a military leader named Napoleon Bonaparte took over and imposed order. Then he gave France a new goal: conquering Europe. By 1815, Napoleon's vision of conquering Europe was finished. But the French Enlightenment's hatred of what it saw as Christianity continued spreading amongst secular intellectuals in other countries: England, Germany, Austria, and Russia. As this movement grew, secular intellectuals made sure that it came to dominate the universities. Who were these apostles of reason between 1600 and 1850? Here are some of the major contributors from France, Holland, Germany, and England that laid the foundations for this major transformation of Western civilization: René Descartes, Baruch Spinoza, Richard Simon, Thomas Chubb, Thomas Woolston, Christian von Wolff, Jean Astruc, Charles Louis Montesquieu, Peter Anet, Herman Samuel Ramirez, Voltaire, Julien de la Mettrie, Denis Diderot, Claude Helvetius, von Holbach, Immanuel Kant, Johann Semler, James Hutton, Gotthold Ephraim Lessing, Johann von Herder, Simon Laplace, Johann Eichhorn, and Heinrich Paulus. The most effective assault on any fortress or institution is to take out the foundations, because then everything built on them will crumble from its own weight. There are a number of logical fallacies and devices of persuasion that can be used to promote a faulty viewpoint while ridiculing an alternative viewpoint, and philosophers, politicians, and advertisers have been using these for centuries. Remember, whoever controls education and the media tends to win, because they control the concepts, definitions, explanations, and evidence given to the masses, and they can demonize their critics who do not have equal access to the media. As this was a revolt against Christendom based on the Bible, secular intellectuals ridiculed the supernatural and biblical explanations for history and nature, while confidently assuming and promoting an opposite philosophical viewpoint, based on materialism, the belief that only physical matter is real, and naturalism, the belief that natural processes are the only shapers of matter, with an inherent tendency to organize matter into ever higher levels of order, even capable of transforming inanimate matter into simple life. Thus, all one needs is lots of time, and natural processes alone will inherently make everything better and better. On that basis, European intellectuals began inventing plausible-sounding natural progress stories that contradicted biblical ideas at every possible point, especially concerning history and nature. Keep in mind that Islam controlled the Middle East until Napoleon's campaign into Egypt around 1800, so Jewish and Christian scholars were not able to visit and investigate evidence for the biblical view of the ancient Middle East until after 1800. Thus, the basic Enlightenment scenario was formulated during the 1700s on the basis of an assumed philosophical paradigm, not observation and evidence. Lots of confident assertions were made that they hoped evidence yet to be found would eventually confirm. The earliest attacks were made against the Bible, and since inspiration is tied to men that God spoke to, or men moved by God's Spirit, the earliest targets were the authors and date of writing for Bible books. Disconnect the writing of Bible books from inspired authors and the time they were traditionally produced, and you have effectively discredited the Bible as just another piece of human literature, if not fiction produced by later dishonest Jewish scribes to deceive people. Interestingly, many of the skeptics assaulting the credibility of the Hebrew Bible were Germans, no possibility of bias against Jews there, and philosophers rather than trained theologians. The general approach was to assert that all but a few of the Bible books were written long after the traditional date by unknown editors, blending together various myths, legends, and adding fictional accounts of Jewish heroes and miracle stories. Hermann Hupfeld asserted that Moses could not have written the Torah during the 1400s BC because there were no written languages anywhere in the world at that time. Instead, it was imagined that the Torah was compiled in the 5th century BC after the Babylonian exile by unknown Jewish scribes or editors who blended together ancient Canaanite and Mesopotamian myths and legends, primarily 4 traditions, divided by the use of 2 words for God, Jehovah or Yahweh, and Elohim, the priestly material, and the much later Deuteronomy material. The book of Joshua and the conquest of Canaan were declared to be a later fictional saga written by court poets to flatter later Jewish kings and glorify the Jewish nation as God's favorite people. Doubts were raised about everything in Old Testament history if there was no outside evidence to support their validity. Questions were raised about the existence of the ancient cities mentioned in Genesis 10 through 12, the Hittites, or the Assyrian king Sargon mentioned in Isaiah 20, verse 1. It was asserted that there was no evidence beyond the biblical mention of King David or Solomon, and the tabernacle and temple probably never actually existed. The dates and reigns of the Hebrew kings were asserted to be filled with contradictions, and there was no evidence that Belshazzar was ever the king ruling the city of Babylon. Keep in mind that these doubts were raised during the 1700s and early 1800s, and became an entire web of suspicion against the Bible's validity, well entrenched in European skeptical scholarly circles before anyone could actually enter the Islam-controlled Middle East to investigate such questions. The same approach was applied to the New Testament. All miracles, being supernatural events, were simply dismissed as either never happening or were natural occurrences that were misunderstood by ignorant, superstitious, pre-scientific people. Jesus probably either never existed or was just a normal man later deified and embellished with miracle stories by the 4th century church. However, the stuff that could be used against Christianity, papal corruption, the Crusades, the Inquisition, and Reformation warfare were all taken at face value, even exaggerated, and portrayed in the most negative way. Today, you may hear that the Crusades assaulted innocent, peace-loving Muslims in the Middle East, and Dan Brown's Da Vinci Code asserted that the medieval church murdered 5 million witches.